Hey everyone, Andrew here, and it's time for my top 5 films that I saw in 2020. I saw a lot of really interesting, bizarre little films out there this year. But if I had to go, if this list was entirely decided by the film I watched the most, then the winner would be Tammy and the T-Rex. Yeah, no, I actually really liked this film, and yes, I know everyone, you've all heard that this is a terrible, horrible film. I, I'm not going to dissuade you from that. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a lot of fun. It's got interesting performances. It's got a unique story. I really liked the animatronic for the T-Rex and the fact that it was really there, which, if that film was made today, it would be a CGI T-Rex and it would not work. Um, and anytime that the T-Rex did something that was relatively human-like, like it looked at itself in a hand mirror and made a phone call, it was just like the funniest thing. Just ridiculous. I was rolling, and it was super violent and graphic and really interesting. It was like, wow, okay. I enjoyed it. I watched it 3 times last year, and I have it sitting on my DVR to watch again this year. So, I also watched Upgrade, which is a really good sci-fi action movie. It's like kind of like the best reimagining of RoboCop ever. I watched a bunch of foreign films this year. The first one I started off with is I watched the Lone Wolf and Cub series. I watched the first 4 of that series. It's a really pretty, really interesting samurai series about trying to be a good dad while the entire country is hunting you down. It gets a little ridiculous by the 4th one, where his entire stroller that he's been pushing the kid around in is just a giant weapon, and he's just gunning people down in it. But it's still a really beautiful, really interesting, well-told series. And I'm really hoping to see the 5th and 6th film this year, if I can. Films, I watched a whole bunch of versions of Journey to the West. I watched Chinese Odyssey 1 and 2, which stars Stephen Chow as the Monkey King, and is really good, really funny. The first one is a little all over the place, but the second one is very good and ends really strongly. Then I watched one directed by Stephen Chow called Journey to the West, and that one was amazing. It's just beautifully shot. The only negative I have about it is it isn't starring Stephen Chow. But other than that, it's beautifully shot. I absolutely fell in love with the female lead in this, and what happens to her makes me very sad. And it's the first time they show the Monkey King as a real kind of demon and made him actually kind of scary and kind of threatening. I watched the Monkey King trilogy, and I will say the only one of those that I would recommend in any way, shape, or form is the third one, because that one at least is fun and interesting. I watched Immortal Demon Hunter, which is very serious and dramatic, but it has some really good effects and really good storytelling parts of it. I watched the Monster Hunt series, which is a family film. 2 monster hunters who find this monster queen, and she ends up impregnating the guy, and he ends up giving birth to this monster baby, and he has to try to protect the baby from other hunters and from other monsters. And it's just a really fun family series I enjoyed the hell out of. I also watched this Norwegian movie called Troll Hunter, which is it's a mockumentary about the people that go and hunt down the trolls in Norway, and it's actually really good. I also watched The Host, a really good horror film, which has got some good darkness to it. It gets scary elements. It's really interesting to have a CGI monster in the daylight work as well as that one did. It's really well told, really interesting. I only negative I have with that is how it ended, but otherwise I enjoy that film a lot. And yeah, I watched a bunch of horror movies this year, and I watched You Might Be the Killer, which is a flip on the slasher genre, where you're following the killer around, but he doesn't know he's the killer, and he's trying to figure out what's going on. And it's got a really good cast, and it's kind of like a Buffy the Vampire Slayer-esque. There was Final Girls, not to be confused with Final Girl, which I also watched, which is terrible, don't watch. Final Girls was a really interesting slasher film where basically a group of teenagers go to a one-night midnight showing of a slasher film and end up getting sucked into the film and having to try and survive. And it's really interesting, got some really good dynamics, and they left it open for a sequel, and I kind of hope they do, but you never know. Then there was Detention. And this one was a trippy, trippy film. It's like basically every single horror sci-fi element that could be thrown into a film is thrown into this one, and it's a lot. I mean, you got mutants, aliens, two different types of time travel, the end of the world. It just and it's really hard to follow. I had to rewind certain scenes like over and over again to try to figure out what the hell was going on, and I could feel my brain starting to leak out my ears, but in a good way. I understood it by the time I watched the whole movie through a second time. It was like, oh, okay, this makes a lot more sense now. And then there was also Freaks of Nature, which is a sci-fi comedy horror where it's like you got a town that is populated by humans, zombies, and vampires, and basically on the night that everything breaks down and they all decide they're going to try to kill each other, aliens show up and start taking all the people of the town, and you're left with these three teenagers. One knows who's a human, one who's a recently turned vampire, one who's a recently turned zombie, and they have to try to figure out how to stop the aliens. It's actually a lot of fun, really good. I watched it 3 times. I enjoyed it a lot. Also, I watched Return of the Living Dead, which is a spin-off spiritual sequel to Night of the Living Dead, and I enjoyed it a lot. It's really funny, really interesting. It actually presents the zombies in an almost destructible like way, but also gives them a bit of humanity. It's fun. I love the ending. I 5 seconds before it happened, I'm like, well, it'd be really cool if it ended this way, and then it did, and I was happy. I also watched Return of the Living Dead 3. It was alright. I want to watch 2, but I haven't got my hands on it yet. Oh, I also watched a couple documentaries. One was a horror documentary called The Crystal Lake Memoirs. This goes and breaks down the entirety of the Friday the 13th series. It is 600 minutes long. Now, that sounds like a lot. I found it easier to think about it as a 13-part miniseries. So you get a 45-minute segment talking about each of the films in the series. And I love Friday the 13th. It's the series that got me into horror. It's my favorite horror killer, and one of my favorite horror movies is the first film of that series that I saw. And you all can guess in the bottom which one you think it might be. I'll give you a hint. It's one of the ones that's considered bad. But yeah, no, I enjoyed it. This was made perfectly for me, and I loved every minute of it. It's a lot of fun. I actually was shocked that they talked about the TV show. It didn't make me want to watch the TV show. It's the only Friday the 13th thing I haven't seen. But it still was really good. I enjoyed a lot of it. I also watched What We Left Behind, looking back at Star Trek DS9. It was really interesting. It's a series that I particularly like, but I don't love it. It's not even in my top 3 Star Wars TV series. But it's had a lot of stuff going for it and a lot of interesting things. And it was really nice to go through and hear about what was going on with the cast and crew and how insane it got and how much heart and effort they put into it. And they also pitched like it's like if we came back now, what would be the next season? And they pitched a pilot episode for that. And it was actually really interesting. I also watched a documentary called Life After Flash, which was about the guy that played Flash Gordon in the 1980s film. And it was really interesting to hear all of the little stuff that went into making that film and how insane that production kind of was. And then what happened to him afterward and how he went from being, kind of forgotten to being this now big staple of conventions. It's really interesting, really cool. I watched a lot of interesting, like, little individual films. There's one I really liked called Turbo Kid. And I saw this 3 times because I enjoyed it so much. It's basically post-apocalyptic world. Kid is living on his own. He is obsessed with this comic about a guy named Turbo Man who had a glove that could disintegrate things, and ends up finding out that that guy is real and died. And so he takes the glove and he becomes Turbo Kid, and he develops this relationship with this girl who turns out to be a cyborg. And she gets captured, and he has to go and try to rescue her with his new disintegrating glove. And it's really good, really interesting. You got Michael Ironside as the villain who's hamming it up to the heavens, and it's really good. I enjoyed this. I saw Blinded by the Light, which is a coming of age story for a Pakistani kid in England who discovers Bruce Springsteen music and gets into love music, and he gets him to experience the world around him and change the way he looks at life. This is one of those films that a lot of people look down on because they don't like Bruce Springsteen music. And I'm like, okay, well, I do what I did, which is I I replaced Bruce Springsteen in my brain with the band that I grew up with that did that for me. So for me, I was watching it and he was listening to and talking about Linkin Park because that's the band that got me into music. It's the band that told me that there was more music outside of the stuff that I grew up on, which was country, and it changed my world and changed my life. So it's like you can do that with any band that you have that with. I can see people doing that now to like Lady Gaga or something because it's a timeless kind of story. I mean, it's really specifically the '80s, but you could make it in your brain to be about any time period. I also saw Sing Street, another '80s set film that was about a kid wanting to impress a girl, so he started a band. And it's a really sweet, heartfelt story, and the music is amazing, and it highly recommend. Just a beautifully put together film. I watched Lion, which is a story of basically an Indian kid that got separated from his family and got adopted by this Australian couple, and then as an adult goes looking for his real family and finally figures out and places it where they are. And it's really heartfelt and really emotional and really beautifully told story. I watched Bronson. So Bronson stars Tom Hardy. It is the story of Britain's most violent prisoner and how he goes into prison specifically with the desire to beat the crap out of anyone and everyone. He sees it as his art form. And it's a really great performance from Tom Hardy, and I highly recommend it for just that. However, it is very visceral and bloody, and I'd be a little wary of that. Speaking of bloody and visceral, I saw Mandy with Nicolas Cage. That's another one that's really bloody and visceral, but really well performed. Nick Cage is at his absolute best in this, and you feel everything that he's going through. It's just a beautifully done film. Do recommend that one. I also saw Suspiria for the first time. I was a little wary on this one because it's one of those. I expected it to be one of those artsy fartsy films that's all about the visuals and has no story and is not really that interesting. But it actually has a good story. Really interesting, well done. It has really good graphic, violent deaths. There's a room full of raids a while that just like me. That was like it was a lot, but it's really good, really well done. It's actually and beautifully shot. I do actually like the visuals as well, which is weird. I mean, not weird, but it's weird for me because I'm usually not the big visuals win me over, but the story won me over. I mean, it's a film that starts out with two people dying violent deaths on screen in the first 10 minutes. What's not to love about that for a horror movie? One that almost made it to my top five of the year. It's like, this was, like, I cut this off at the last minute just because it's a live performance that didn't have as much kind of work put into it as some of the others. And that is Braden Collins' two-man show. Now, if you've watched Whose Line Is It Anyway, this is basically Whose Line Is It Anyway with just the two people. And they give absolutely amazing, hilarious performance. I was rolling in my seat the entire performance. And it's really good, but of course I love it. I've loved every version of Whose Line Is It Anyway, even the weird Game Show Network version that was actually really good. Nobody knows that even it existed. So, my top 5 films that came out in 2020. Now, I'm going to be skipping my number 1 because that one actually made it into my top 5 of all of the films I saw in 2020. But for the films that were released in 2020 that I saw, my number 5 was Enola Holmes. Really interesting reimagining of the young Sherlock Holmes idea, or Sherlock Holmes Jr. idea. I really liked the way it was shot. It was really interesting done. The lead did a very good performance. And it's just, like, overall, I just enjoyed it. It was a really good interpretation of it. There are some minor nitpicks I have with the way it was filmed, and they could have cut off a good 15 minutes and made it perfect, but otherwise, it was a lot of fun and really good mystery. Number 4 is Live from the Space Stage, a Halix story. This is a documentary made by a bunch of people that I follow on YouTube that do retrospectives into Disneyland and the different rides that used to be there and what happened to them and why we missed them. And this is just a look at one little phenomenon that happened in the 80s. For like one summer, Disney came up with this band to perform on their space stage, and they're basically the space version of Queen, and it's really interesting and really epic. And they managed to take what little information they have and little footage and this little bit that they got going and make a whole really interesting documentary. I do highly recommend this if you have any interest in Disneyland and its history. It's on YouTube. It's free. It's a lot of fun. Do recommend it. Number 3 for me was The Skywalker Legacy. This was a documentary about the making of the ninth Star Wars film, The Rise of Skywalker. And I'm a huge Star Wars fan, but I did not like Rise of Skywalker. I'll be one of the first people to admit it. It's like it had a lot of flaws for me. This documentary really shows you how much effort and heart and work they put into this film. Like they spent days figuring out little sequences that are 2-second shots in this film. Like we got to figure out what these puppets look like and how things that you think are CGI are puppets in this. And it's just you see how it ties into the original series and the heart that they put into it and the effort that they put into it. And you get it's like I think this documentary is way better than the film that they made. And it's you watch that and you can just see and you just understand there are so many little things here that if they had just tweaked it, if they had just thought it through a little better or done these little changes, we might have had one of the best Star Wars films of all time. But instead we got a film. But we still got an amazing documentary out of it that I highly recommend. And number 2 for me was Onward by Pixar. And it's not surprising to have Pixar on this list, but it is. I know some people will be like, well, what about the other Pixar film that just came out, which is Soul? And I liked Soul. I didn't love Soul. Basically, Soul to me is Coco meets Inside Out, but not nearly as good as either of those. But it's still got some stuff in it that works really well. Whereas Onward, I thought, was a really okay idea that they just took and made something kind of beautiful and amazing with. It starts off a little sketchy. You're like, okay, this is just our world, but with some fantasy elements mixed in. Oh. But as it gets going, you get more of the characters and more of the world and more of the heart. And I really love the message of this film. It's like that just because you don't have this parent doesn't mean you don't have someone who is that for you. As someone who was raised by a single parent, I completely understand that story arc and that mindset. And it's just a really beautifully well told story. And just by the end, you're like it starts off kind of here, and by the end, you're just kind of crying along with the characters. It's beautiful and well told. And again, like I said, I'm going to skip my number 1 because it's on my top 5 of 2020. So let's move on to that. The Little Prince. When I first saw the trailer for this animated movie, I was like, oh, this could be interesting. I remember that there's a book about this. And I watched it, and I just was so blown away by the level of animation and the characters and the story. And the message of, being a kid is important. Enjoying yourself as a kid is important. And keeping that purity and that honesty in your life always is something that not only should you do, but we should all strive to do. If you let it, adulthood can bog you down and ruin all of the things that used to make you you. And it's just so well told and so well animated. It was just kind of heartwarming. I loved it. It's one of those films that I think will go on to be a animation classic. And it just deserves it because it's just beautiful and brilliant. So I watched a bunch of movies off this list that What Culture did that was top 10 horror movies that broke all the rules. And that included the Detention, You Might Be the Killer, Final Girls. But it also included this one film that I'd heard about, but I hadn't seen. And I finally went and saw it, and it was just amazing and just so well told and so interesting. And that was Tucker and Dale versus Evil. Now, I knew the two people that played the leads in this from other stuff, and they're always pretty good. But I was a little wary because it's presented as this kind of typical horror movie to you. It's like you get a group of teenagers going out in the woods, they come across these two hillbillies that look scary, and they start building in their minds that these guys are going to be killers and they're going to try to hurt you. And then it cuts perspectives, and you switch over to see from Tucker and Dale's side, and they're like two of the nicest people. They have everything that you're seeing as evil. It's just them being awkward, or just it's odd the way you see them, or they just didn't think something through. And it's really interesting to just see how that develops and how that grows. Because it's like, you get to a point where one of the teenagers thinks that they're spying on her. She slips and hits her head and falls in the lake. Tucker and Dale grab her. They take her to their house, and they help her recover. And she starts to realize, that these are actually good guys, and they're not actually dangerous at all. All of her friends think these two are serial killer hillbillies, and we have to go kill them and go rescue our friend, and end up they go and try to kill them, and they usually end up killing themselves. And the best one is one of them tries to go take a dive at Dale while he's throwing wood into a wood chipper, and he bends down to pick up a piece of wood, and the kid sails over him and lands head first into the wood chipper. And you're like, oh no! And Dale's freaks out and grabs the legs and is trying to pull the kid out. But all of the teenagers, all they see is Dale shoving a kid into the wood chipper. And it just keeps building and building and building on top of that. And it's just so interesting and so well told. And you can see every single piece of, oh, this will be important at a certain point. This will be important at a certain point. And it just got two of the most likable, nerdy actors playing in it as the leads. And it's amazing. I love it. And it's sad that this is one of those films this film was a direct-to-DVD. Most people have never heard of it. And that makes me sad because this is so fun and so interesting. And this is definitely going to be a cult classic. This could have easily just been a classic horror film, a well-respected and loved horror film, had the people making it released it, into theaters and made a big deal about it. They could have made a lot of money because this was a right up my alley, and I can bet it's up a lot of people's alley. The Wandering Earth. So I came across this through one of the YouTube channels that I follow. They would go and do box office, and they would do this is the top 10 worldwide, and that's how I found out about one of the movies that made my list for last year for 2019 of best films, which was Extreme Job. Showed up in there, and during the same time they were talking about this Chinese film that was doing really well, especially in China, called The Wandering Earth. And I'm like, okay, well, if it's doing that well, there's got to be something about it. I'll give it a look if I can ever find it. It's on Netflix, which I finally have, so yay, I can watch it. And this film is just absolutely amazing and stunning. It is China's most expensive sci-fi film ever made, and it shows. One of the things that I've learned through watching all of these foreign films this year is that China, when they put CGI in a film, it never tends to look good. It always tends to look fuzzy or off or just ugly in general. This film has a few handful of moments like that, but most of the time it's just absolutely gorgeous. So Wandering Earth is the story of basically the sun has died, Earth is about to lose all life, and we decide that we need to go to this new planet the first planet that we discovered that could support human life, but it is thousands of light years away. So they turn the Earth into a spaceship. Basically, they put jets all around it that are basically dug into the core and feed off the core of the Earth and use it as propulsion to propel the Earth forward. And I love the fact that it's not any kind of really futuristic technology. This is not light speed travel. They're not going to get to there in a decade or so. This is a 2,000-year journey. And they are living underground trying to survive. And basically they get to Jupiter and the engines cut out. And now they have to basically take the starter core to the engines and start all of the engines back up before they get sucked into Jupiter's atmosphere and die. And this film is epic. It feels epic. The closest thing that I could think of that this feels of, and it reminds me of, Michael Bay's Armageddon or the original Independence Day. It has this level of just, you feel the full energy of the film. You just, at least the last half of this film has that. First half of this film has a couple questionable points. A lot of it is the logic. The main character has some weird logic choices. For one, he is mad at his father, who is on a space station, basically ahead of Earth, plotting the track. He's mad at his father because he thinks his father is the reason his mother died. The father had a choice. Only 2 people could go into the shelter, and the mother was already dying. She would not survive. So instead, he sent the grandfather with the kid into the shelter. Now, I can understand the kid being mad at that, but it's also been like 7 years since that happened. You think he would have thought it through a little bit more. Secondly, the kid then, when they're trying to take the core to the starter to get it started, they end up in this elevator shaft and they have to carry the core up. And so they lower down the ropes to drag the core up. And the kid grabs the ropes from the military people and it's like, no, you're going to send the people up first. The core doesn't matter. The people go first. And I'm like, that core is the only thing that can keep us all from dying. I'm like, I was amazed the military guy didn't just shoot him and keep going. That's what I would have done. Later, one of the military people just shoots the core for no reason. Like, one of the other military people died trying to lug the thing, and she got sick of them fighting over whether or not to keep going, so she shot the core. I'm like, good job, girl. You just doomed us all. Thank you very much. Ugh. That said, the rest of the movie is so good and so interesting and so well told. It gets to this point where it's just like everything is building on top of everything, and it fills you with so much hope and so much positivity, and you just like, it's so good to see the positives of humanity, that we do not give up, that we would keep fighting, even if it's a 0% chance of us surviving. And there's so many sci-fi references and so many different things. You got Armageddon, you got Independence Day, you got 2001: A Space Odyssey, you got Gravity, and just all of these things going together, and it just builds into this beautiful, amazing film that I was on my feet at, and it's like, I'm amazed to have gotten that here in my house, not at a movie theater, just watching it haphazardly while playing on my phone, and I managed to get that into this film. So, yeah, I watched a lot of foreign films. I watched a lot of horror films. So it's not surprising to me that one of my favorite films this year was a horror foreign film. And that, of course, was Train to Busan. It was a film that just works perfectly. It is a Korean zombie film that is just told simplistically and perfectly. These zombies are a credible, interesting threat. Each of the human characters has something going for them. They have something interesting about them. You really feel for them. You really understand what they're fighting for. It's just expertly told, expertly written. This is, honestly, to me, probably the best zombie film made since the original Night of the Living Dead. It is just expertly told. And it's really simplistic, and it's really just amazing that they got so well told out of this. And I got to see the short animated prequel called Soul Station, which it was okay. It didn't really work for me, but I didn't expect it to. But then I'm also been wanting to watch Train to Peninsula, which is the sequel, and sadly I'm hearing that it's not as good, and that it's a little overly done with bad CGI and this, that, and the other. And it makes me sad, because like, the first one works because it's so simple and easy to understand, but told expertly. Some of you might be wondering, it's like, all right, well, every film that you've listed was pre-2020, and you said that your number one, released in 2020, was on this list. Well, of course, that means it's also my number one. Can any of you guess? So, my number one was, of course, Hamilton. How could it not be? This I was a little worried, just a little bit, because I don't tend to like the musicals that everyone says are the be-all, end-all stuff. I don't understand the appeal of Chorus Line. I don't understand the appeal of Cats. I don't understand the appeal of Phantom of the Opera or Jersey Boys. None of those have ever worked for me. Granted, I've never seen any of those live, but still, it's that thing of, I don't tend to agree with it. So Hamilton, when I first heard about it, I was just like, eh. And people were like, you need to hear the music. And I would listen to the opening song and be like, well, that's just Sweeney Todd. I don't, eh. But it's a thing of like, all right, if I can find a way to watch it, I will give it a shot. And then Disney was like, oh yeah, we're releasing Hamilton on Disney Plus. I'm like, okay, I can watch that. That's fine. I did not expect for it to be the quintessential perfect musical. It is so well told, so beautifully done, just absolutely brilliantly made film and show and production. Like it, I was expecting what you tend to get with some of these things where it's like you have three static cameras and a couple cameras meant for zoom in, but they actually did some dramatic and interesting filming with this. But it's also just the story itself and the way it's told, just as this operatic hip hop story, and that they managed to take what looks like a very basic set. It's just an empty wood set with two levels, but then the floor rotates, and then you also just the way it's shot and the way it's filmed, or the way it's set up and the way it's performed, and all of the dances and all of the different styles of singing, the different styles of rap, and just blend perfectly to make, for me, and I would make this argument against any musical ever. I think this is the best musical of all time. Definitely the best filmed musical of all time. Just works on every single level. You got romance, you got heart, you got energy, you got unique dances, unique singing, unique performances. And you got to give it up to Lin-Manuel Miranda because he just nailed this entire show out of the park. When him as Alexander Hamilton is the part that you can kind of go, he wasn't the best. It's like, yeah, but he's performing out of the top of his game. It's just that he's surrounded himself with people who are amazing too, and gave even more stellar performances. But the fact that he starred in this, wrote it, sings in it, did all of the work, made this show exist, and got all of these ideas from reading an autobiography about a white man is amazing. Who in the hell reads an autobiography about a founding father and is like, you know what this needs? A hip hop musical. Like, that's insane. Who would think of that? And it's one of those things, like, for me, like, Lin-Manuel Miranda never needs to do anything ever again. He will be infamous forever. He's going to be one of the biggest names in Broadway and Hollywood and movies and theater forever because of this one show. And that's amazing. Like, it's like, yeah, you got to give him props for that. Like, no one else could do that because it's an insane thing that only one person could really do. And I love it. I just love everything about it. Like, this is a perfect film. It is a one-of-a-kind experience. I highly recommend it. I would recommend getting Disney Plus just for Hamilton. It is worth it. You pay one time, $8 per month. Go watch Hamilton 4 times. It's worth it. It's amazing. I mean, I've only watched it twice, but I plan to watch it at least 100 more times in my lifetime. It might become one of those movies I watch every year for the rest of my life. I don't know, but it's worth it. Like, I want them to put it out on DVD so I can own it, so I can have it forever. And yeah, that was my top 5 films that I saw in 2020. What did you all think? Did you have some films that you saw that you would like to recommend or you'd like to hear my thoughts on? Is anyone else out there like a big supporter of Tammy and the T-Rex like I am? Or is like heard of some of these more obscure stuff? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you all for listening. You have a wonderful day. Happy watching, and I'll see you all soon. Hopefully. Bye.